This program is designed to provide general information with regards to the subject matters covered. This information is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, sponsors, or station are engaged in rendering any specific and personal, medical, financial, legal, counseling, professional service, or any advice. You should seek the services of competent professionals before applying or trying any suggested ideas.
Good morning, truth seekers and true crime junkies. Nanette Bartow is back with another week of Hit the Road Jack, Finding the Zodiac. This week's we're going to try and make it through some information fairly quickly, so I will be talking fast, as if that's not a thing I already do. I'm going to try and blast through some stuff to get us into the Zodiac period and out of the Sherry Jo Bates period. For now, I'm going to bring up the presentation and we're going to start going over new information that I have found. Some laundering research that I did this last week is meeting with Harriet Suchet in regards to the items that were lost in Dennis's storage shed, purchased or at auction by another individual, and then eventually sold back to Harriet after that individual realized he could not basically extort her. Funny that the Zodiac case is an extortion case. He was asking, I think, for $50,000 at first to have this stuff back. And when Harriet refused to pay that, he decided he was going to take it down to Hollyweird. And he did not like the responses he was getting and actually told her he feared for his life and wanted nothing to do with it. And I think she picked the whole lot up for about $800. But she did come in this last week and we were able to go through a majority of items that Dennis had kept in regards to the investigation, stuff all the way back to 2000, including letters that were being imaged on the internet at that point in time, emails between him and Tom Voigt, emails between him and the law enforcement agencies, conversations with the law enforcement agencies. I was able to actually get all the contacts that he had. So we're going to see a lot of reintroduction of some information. And then, of course, I'm going to make some corrections because his book, by the way, which Dennis did actually have a book. I wasn't sure. Let's see if everybody can see that. It was called The Man Behind the Mask. Of course, this one looks like it's been through hell and back, as the Zodiac does. At any rate, there's information in this book, and I have to remind people that as I do read through some of these things that Dennis did not do his due diligence when it came to a lot of the paperwork Jack had. So he wasn't entirely aware of all of the places Jack was, what he was doing, time frames he might have had a little mixed up, but I don't necessarily blame him for that because he was a child at that time. And obviously, you know, in 2000, when he's trying to go back and recall these particular time frames and things that were happening, he may have had those memories a little confused, but I will make those corrections as we go along. And of course, that will be based on evidence in Jack's belongings, not just my theories or thoughts. So one of the things that, let's see, so it does turn out that Jack did marry Eco per Dennis's book. So he actually did commit bigamy twice. Once in Japan when he married Eco while he was still married to Letha back here in the United States. And then again with Doris Reynolds when he married her while still married to Letha in 1964. And also per Jack or Dennis's book, Jack faced rape charges by Doris. Now, I don't know if it was Jack forcing himself on Doris, but it does not indicate anything about a daughter involvement. So that is very different than what we've seen in Stephen Dewhurst's book. And it still brings me back to why a woman would marry and even then remarry a man who did something like this to her, because obviously she had spent a number of years with Jack and knew exactly who he was, what he was about. So again, some unexplainable stuff, but here in this picture, you can kind of see the mess of paperwork that was brought to me by Harriet. So jumping back to last week's, I'm trying to get out of Sherry Jo Bates, like I said, but I did still want to make a couple points here. One of those points, the cancellation postmark is not the same on the Patricia Houts letter as the April 67 letters. And this particular postmark was actually stamped on purportedly in 1967. However, I'm not really sure about the validity of that. Again, the makeup of that particular stamp is different than the ones that we see for the 3 letters in April. I was informed by a postmaster general, former, should I say, retired, that the stamp would be indicative of where it was actually mailed out of. So each postal location that would take in mail would actually have their own postmark. That way it could be identified to which location. So that would tell me that at that particular point in time in 1966 and 67, there was at least 2 locations that that the Zodiac may have visited to mail his letters. Now, we did talk a little bit as I was getting into it, the slant of the postmark. The first thing the Postmaster General noticed is that anything with a slant on it would have indicated that it was a hand stamp, not a manual or a machine stamp, as we had seen before. The Postal Service has been using machine stamps, cancellation stamps for hundreds of years, basically. I mean, I think it was back in the 1800s. It was actually invented. So it's something that has been around for a very long time, and a majority of the mail goes through that unless you walk into the post office and ask for one of the clerks to hand stamp it in front of you. Now, that brings me to a couple different things. One is that some of these letters did not have postage on them, i.e. one of the first confession letters, to homicide detail, did not have postage on it. And it was obviously a very creative style printing on that envelope, which would lead me to believe that an employee would have taken serious note to this particular envelope, since A, it wasn't properly addressed, and B, it did not have any postage. So that's not something that the Postmaster General could explain, because had I set an envelope onto the counter and asked for a cancellation stamp, there should have been a stamp on it to cancel. So either one of 2 things: either he's working with somebody inside the post office, or he has access to these particular types of stamps through the avenues, and like I said, government involvement through the avenues of being either that IRS or Treasury goon that Harriet Suchet has thinks that she has discovered about him, or whatever it might be. It is not going through the normal path that the public would have received. And I think that most of us would have been instructed to either completely fill the address out, or at minimum to pay for the postage that was being canceled. So basically, the 2 that are matching out of this is the I spelt daily wrong down there. Dialy Enterprise, the confession letter, and the Patricia Houts letter share the same exact postmark. So bringing that in, I noticed again that the cancellation mark that is being placed on these particular documents. Oh, and you can see right over here, here is one of the confession letters that were sent. Come back over here to the Daily Enterprise, Riverside, California. So there's actually no physical address, though I do believe that the post office would know exactly where the Daily Enterprise was. And it does say up here on all of these cancellation stamps, always use zip code. And so there's no zip code, there's no physical address. It's just listed to the Daily Enterprise. And again, we have a hand stamp because it is crooked. It is not in line with the actual envelope. And we can clearly see that there is no postage there. So I want to question how he was able to get this to move through that process without it being properly done. Again, we can show the incline of the actual hand stamp here. Always use zip code. So let's see, not properly addressed. Postmaster Inspector was the only person to claim that Sherry Jo Bates' handwriting was not a match to the Zodiac Killer's writing. And I didn't find that to be a coincidence. I'm sorry, maybe I did find it to be a coincidence. Either way, to note that the postmaster inspector was the only person who declared there was not a match between the Sherry Jo Bates handwriting and the Zodiac's letters. It contradicted the Department of Justice, who indicated that yes, they were in fact a match written by the same person, and this was a long-held belief for quite some time. Now, of course, the postmaster inspector had come in as a second opinion, and then they reached out for a third. And the third from the government had indicated that it was a probability that these did come from the same person. However, it appeared they were using disguised handwriting. So in the end, we have 2 to 3 on the government side. And then, of course, we have several document examiners in the private sector that have made connections between the Sherry Jo Bates letters, the Zodiac letters, the Black Dahlia letters, and the lipstick killing letters. So we are not the only ones that believed this. There is law enforcement and government trained document examiners that believe that as well. So in this last week, I also received a communication on YouTube from a commenter named CD. Now, the interesting part about this is that I cannot go back and find these postings anymore. In fact, the last message that the individual sent me, I could only read a portion of it because when I proceeded to click on it, it would go blank and I would not see anything that we had been discussing last week. But what we did discuss was the Mary Patricia Houts instance, in which case there was a Mary Patricia Houts that existed in San Bernardino in 1967, I believe. And that person had indicated to me that I might want to look up an article in regards to a marriage between that person, and had stated that since and nobody could find this Patricia Houts, they had never heard anything else in regards to that. I highly doubt that, only because I literally got on the internet. I typed in Mary Patricia Houts, San Bernardino, and within seconds, I came across a website called murderandcorp.wordpress.com, and it's called Murder Inc. is the actual site. So I wanted to just give you a quick breakdown on something that I found rather astonishing by the time I put the information together. So, of course, we have Sherry Jo Bates over here in 1966, who's killed. She goes to school with Cecilia Shepard, who's actually killed in 1969. Now, Cecilia Shepard's sister, Kathleen Shepard, works at St. Bernardine's Hospital with this gal who's killed over here, Nancy Easton, in 1974. An honor attendee, now I don't know if there's any relation between this individual. It's just, again, maybe highly coincidental, but an honor attendee at Kathleen Shepard's wedding was a Linda Bates. Not sure if she is related to the family in any manner, but Kathleen and her husband Raymond Schreckognost, I'm not going to be able to, Schreckengast, there we go, both attended Pacific Union College, as did Brian Hartnell. So we know that Cecilia Shepard was killed and Brian Hartnell was attacked at Lake Berryessa with Cecilia Shepard, and lo and behold, both Cecilia's sister and her husband attended Pacific Union College in Angwin, which is just above the Napa area. Now, moving on to Nancy Easton, who was killed in 1974 and worked with Kathleen Shepard. Her boyfriend, Buzz Teeter, works with Mary Patricia Houts's father, which got even more convoluted. William Houts in the California Forest Service. Now, Jack is extremely familiar with the Forest Service. In fact, I found several camping permits for him for fires and things of that nature. So he would probably make small talk, come into contact with these rangers and so forth, no doubt in my mind. But the fact that Nancy Easton, who works with Kathleen Shepard, Cecilia Shepard's sister, who is another murder victim, and to find out that Nancy Easton is dating Buzz Teeter, who works with William Houts in the California Forest Service, to me, I just about fell out of my chair. Now, there was also a lady named Janet Judith Gold, killed in 1975. The area is fairly similar if you're talking about the overall California area. I want to say that it was within an hour where Big Bear was, where she was killed. I haven't really kind of put her together just yet. I haven't researched these murders in depth. And that's something we'll talk about when we get to 74 and 75. But what I did find from her murder was that her car was left outside the restaurant or lounge that she was last seen in, with the keys in the ignition. Her husband had actually gone out to look for her in the late hours of the morning, or the early hours of the morning, and he found her car outside of the restaurant with the keys in it, and he was able to drive it home. So obviously I would think there was no tampering with the car if he was able to simply get in, turn over the ignition, and drive away. But the car being left with the keys in it is something that we have seen in some of these cases. Moving on to Mary Patricia Houts, the connection here, her husband, Melvin A. Chadwick, works with what was called the TRW systems, which I'm to understand based on this little article over here that Northrop Grumman played a vital role, as we had learned from Harriet, in the code or the decode, the solve that she found from the Patricia Houts letter, which actually mentioned Northrop Grumman. TRW was brought in because they needed engineers after the actual software programs had been put together. So Northrop Grumman actually hired TRW, who, based on this, or this individual's recollection of it, they actually worked there, was just a couple blocks down the road from Northrop Grumman. So let's see here. Melvin Chadwick, Mary Patricia Houts, actually, the article I found initially was indicating that she had married Melvin Chadwick, who worked for TRW Systems, who at the time provided engineers for the NASA Apollo missions and more. And then after Chadwick actually left the Army, he became a cartoonist for TRW. So I thought, again, we're pulling back in the media here, still revolving around NASA, which they actually developed military and civil space systems and was acquired later in 2002 by Northrop Grumman. So a very neat little connection there. So moving on to the Houts letter in 1967, that ties right back to Sherry Jo Bates, written about a boy who murdered her. Suchet's solve talked specifically about Northrop Grumman and the NASA Apollo mission. So now I'm a little skeeved out that these messages inside of a message are actually yielding a connection directly back to these individuals. And somehow all of these individuals are on this list of the Zodiac. Suchet believes that there was literally a little list. Now, the Zodiac, and we'll be talking about it when it comes up, wrote a poem called The Little List. I do not know if that was somebody else's poem that he just copied down or if that was something that he came up with, but the little list was talking about all the different people who didn't deserve to live, which is kind of fitting with the whole justified, the retribution, the revolution, the hitting back, basically getting back at somebody for something. And as we all know, Suchet believes that that was for the death or the killings and assassinations of RFK and JFK. Evidently, the little list, there was really a person with the last name Little who created the list of the Get Hoffa squad. Another piece of trivia I did not know. So it is starting to appear as though there is some parallel to these decodes that she's coming up with and the circumstantial evidence that is surrounding the Zodiac. So basically, the little list created by Mr. Little for the Get Hoffa squad was a list of people responsible for the Kennedy's death that continued on into, as far as I can tell right now, at 1996. Harriet believes that the list was initiated. Jack began taking care of this list, and at one point they stopped paying him, but that did not stop him from continuing on his mission while he was complaining that payment was not coming in and he was not receiving the money for the job that he was set to do. And that may allude to the fact why he became really hyperactive in the 70s, 80s time frame, where he is stating that politicians should be scared that they're running around with their heads cut off like chickens, which I really didn't understand, because I wouldn't think that politicians were necessarily afraid of a serial killer unless, of course, they had some involvement with him. So that may all wrap itself up into some nice, neat little sack. And the fact that these individuals are all conveniently tying themselves back to one another in one way or another may also mean that these people were part of something that Zodiac felt he needed to actually strike back for. Now, you got to remember, the Zodiac isn't the Zodiac for another 3 years after Sherry Jo Bates. However, we see that this tie-in or this tie back to these particular individuals cannot possibly be some type of a coincidence. So in Dennis's book, I found some interesting information. I had been trying to research. I know that there were other instances of watches found at the scene. I need to go back through my information. I have lots, probably about 9,000 files since I started doing this particular case. I did search the internet thinking it would be a quicker way for me to find those actual cases where watches were found. I know that I remember seeing it specifically on a beachy, sandy area that the cops were holding one. That may have been the Dominguez murders. It could have been the Lake Berryessa murders. Again, and I'm trying to find back, and I didn't want to bring it up or mention it when we talked about the watch at Sherry Jo Bates' crime scene, because again, that was something I didn't know until I started heavily researching Sherry Jo Bates. But in Dennis's book, he stated that let's see here. Zodiac sent a map of the Bay Area to police in 1970. On this map, Zodiac marked his symbol over Mount Diablo, and on a circle, he placed a 3, 6, 9, and an N for north, which had the appearance of a clock face. The N was placed in the 12 o'clock position, assuming he was portraying a clock face. I found out later, Dennis says, after working with several law enforcement agencies, that there had been watches found at several different crime scenes that were possibly the work of the Zodiac. The watches that were found had been purposely stopped at a specific time for reasons unknown. And this information concerning the watches was never made public. The only time this information was made public was during the news coverage of the Riverside woman who was murdered in 1966, Sherry Jo Bates. And that is because at the time the Zodiac didn't exist and they didn't know not to print some type of information like that. They had presumed that the watch had been torn off the suspect as if it was his watch, and they thought that that was a piece of evidence that would help them find the killer. Now it's turning out to look like that these watches may have come from different murders, then being placed at the crime scene as a tieback. And this again brings me back to statements I've made in regards to clues from previous crimes being left at new crimes. Again, information the public hasn't been given, but information that can be gleaned in certain circumstances, especially when law enforcement says, yes, we have lots of information that ties these murders together and we can't tell you what that evidence is. Well, that means that there's something there. And if it wasn't DNA and it wasn't fingerprints, because they didn't have that type of capability back in that day, then it has to be a physical piece of evidence that is left at the crime scene. In some cases, I believe it could have been jewelry, it could have been watches, it could have been some token like the stickers from the Valentine candy that was taken from one crime scene and then placed in the Zodiac letters. These type of pieces of evidence is what we're looking for. This is the information the public needs to put these cases together. So I did kind of pull up some information again. I went back to the Swindles murder and the couple's landlady, who described them as well-behaved, and they took a stroll along the beach each night between 7:30 and 9 p.m. The point I wanted to bring up about that is that the watch appeared to be stopped, and some say 12:23, some say 12:24. Either way, that was not the hour in which they were killed. But had the Zodiac, or let's say Jack, taken this watch from the Swindles, as it may appear to be, and then placed it at the crime scene of Sherry Jo Bates, he may very well have been giving an indication to where he was or where he has been, since we know that the Mount Diablo symbol over the top of the mountain looks and appears as though it's a watch, and it also contains radians, as the Zodiac is discussed. So I also noted that a woman a block and a half away reported hearing 2 gunshot wounds around 8:30 p.m. This would coincide with the landlady's statements that they took the walk between 7:30 and 9 p.m. So we're kind of putting that information together and seeing that that yes, in fact, this is likely the time of death. The woman that was a block away also reported a man crying, no. She said she said she was alone at the time and did not investigate, but the police said robbery could have been a motive because the Swindles wallet was missing, but but they added that other things were not taken, so it did not appear to be a robbery. Now, in Dennis's book, he actually makes a relation to the swindle's watch. It said at the crime scene of Sherry Jo Bates, the police had found a Timex wristwatch laying on the ground not far from Sherry's body. The watch had been stopped at 12:23. So this actually makes me think now, if the watch was a ploy to tie murders together, that if there were two men back in that alley the night of Sherry Jo Bates' death, with flashlights searching for something, it is likely they were searching for the other half of the handle of the knife that was indicated, found at the crime scene. So this, at first, when I thought that the watch might be the suspects, I thought maybe they were back there looking for that. But now to know that this is kind of a cycle that the Zodiac was repeating, it would probably be more likely that they did not want to leave this half of a handle, which may yield palm prints or fingerprints or things of that nature, which really kind of makes me question what did they receive off of that particular item, because clearly it would have been most recently touched at Sherry Jo Bates' murder by her murderer. Either way, the watch had been stopped at 12:23, but the murder occurred between 10 and 10:30. The Riverside police did not know until years later that this murder could be the work of the Zodiac, so the information about the watch that was found was printed in the paper. Zodiac was unknown in 1966. On the following page is a diagram of the radians extending outward from Mount Diablo. So we have Mount Diablo marked here in the inner circle with the north, the 3, the 6, and the 9 placed down on it. On the following page, let's see, one of those radians. So basically the radians extending outward from Mount Diablo, if you extended those radians out, not only did they hit the locations of the Zodiac's crimes, these 3 over here to the left, but we also see that one of those radians runs straight down through the San Bernardino fault line, which would run right through the Riverside area. If that radian was the second hand of the clock, so basically at 12:23, 12:24, whichever you want to perceive that to be, and the 12 o'clock faced north, you could see that that actually made the radian lines of the Riverside death of Sherry Jo Bates. Let's see, precisely the same time that the watch was stopped. So basically, yes, the radian and the lines matched to the precise time that the watch was stopped. The Zodiac sent a letter in 1970 that appeared to be a clock face on Mount Diablo, and that's where he's pulling that information from. So another thing that I wanted to clear up was the handedness of Jack. After talking with Harriet, she had indicated she believed Jack to be primarily left-handed, though he was ambidextrous. I went through the pictures to see if I could determine where his gun was held, and these are the things I kind of came across. So with the mirror imaging in photographs back in the day, we actually got a reversal of the picture because the camera is going to pick up at the direction it is looking at. So one of the things that I'd noted is that we had a picture of a hat on the ground that looked like it was accompanied by a pool of blood. And that hat, the writing on it was backwards because the camera took that picture with a mirror image. And in order to kind of figure out what the lettering was on that hat, we had to flip that picture so that we could read the lettering on it. And we came up that it said UNLV, and it was legible and readable at that point. So I'm going to err on the side of the fact that these are flipped pictures. And if that is the case, we see that Jack is wearing his watch on his right hand. His gun is in his belt. So this is not actually a holster. It's actually tucked right inside of his pants with the butt being prone or to the backside. So that he could grab that handle quickly from this particular hand, which again would make him left-handed. The cigarette is laying to the left side of his mouth. Again, a dominant thing for left-handers. I note that his watch being on the right-hand side is very, very similar to me because I am left-handed and I wear my watch on my right hand. We also see that the way he is laying on the couch allows the left hand to be free to be playing with the cards. Again, holding a gun down here with a dominant left hand. And then, of course, the pictures we actually put up of the way the positioning of these would be flipped, but they would also be in the direction as I determined as a left-hander. If I was to hang my guns on the wall, I would hang them in a position where they were I was easily capable of grabbing them with my left hand or my dominant hand. I did go ahead and put together a few more pieces of information, or at least lettering and numbers and things of that nature. We see that letter P had that backward slant, and then the regression or the backwards movement of the tip of the R's as that moved leftward before it turned right and on into the next letter. These can be signs of left-handedness because that leftward slant is typically indicative of a left-hander. Now, the first thing or the go-to for most people when they attempt to disguise their handwriting, they attempt to change the slant because they think somehow that would deter somebody from determining that it was them. But changing the slant alone is not enough. So whether or not this slant was changed on purpose or it was a true slant, it does indicate left-handedness, which is consistent with Jack. I did actually go through to see what I could find for number twos. And as I pulled up the number twos, we found these tight little loops, almost with this little point that's occurring that are very similar to the number twos in the Sherry Jo or in the Patricia Houts letter. And I kept finding those number twos with those tight little lips with that little cocked or rocked backwards to the right feeling to them. And then, of course, this letter A that was found in attention, I nailed it. I mean, it only took a couple letters for me to go through and find this letter A, as seen in the Patricia Houts letter, where the crossbar crosses just a bit to the right side of the stem. We see the loop in the second stem in the beginning of the stroke. We see the shape at the top as it comes up to a point with a slight roundedness. This is just absolutely dead on identical. I couldn't have found a better letter. And like I said, when I can go through handwriting and arbitrarily just grab letters out of somebody's handwriting and plot that down to something in question and to have them match that superbly, that beautifully, is definitely a home run hit for me in handwriting. It gets me very excited. So the more and more I investigate the handwriting on this letter, the more and more we're able to show the causal link and the similarities to the actual handwriting of Jack. So I did note when I pulled out of the description from Brian Hartnell that he was wearing a cloth hood, dark cloth jacket, dark pants, and he had an automatic pistol in the holster on his right hip. Now, of course, it does not indicate whether or not that holster or the butt of the gun was facing forward or backwards, so it didn't really give me a lot of information as to whether or not what hand Jack was. But I did note that he also carried a knife on his left hip. So he basically was equipped for being able to pull with both hands, probably depending on the situation or what that situation called for. Either way, I see that having a knife, I would think that having the knife on the left hip was his go-to. The gun was there either just to intimidate and probably set up in a position or in a way that he could grab across his body with his left hand while still being able to grab his knife with his left hand. So I'm still going to go with the side of he is a left-hander. So now that we are finally making it into the suspects in this case, Arthur Lee Allen had been the number one suspect. I actually read an article from a newspaper that Dennis had in his belongings, which indicated that Arthur Lee Allen was the only highly investigated number one suspect and thought to be the Zodiac Killer all the way up through 2002. And when that DNA was done and that excluded and exculpated him of these crimes, I'm sure that a whole lot of people had egg on their face and wanted to kick rocks. So they're trying to quickly figure out how they can tear apart this DNA finding. So some of the things that I'm finding now is that, the DNA was not that of the Zodiac. The DNA is the DNA of someone who couldn't have been the Zodiac. So now we'll probably hear them cross-mesh that information with, the DNA done on Arthur Lee Allen wasn't correct. I'm not buying any of that. I am sure that they messed up Jack's DNA on purpose, but I am fairly sure that with 20 on 20 paying for this DNA test, that things were done correctly in order to come to some serious conclusions. I know that in 2003 and 2002, Jack began contacting Tom Voigt That's because Tom Voigt's out there telling a lousy story, the self-proclaimed authority on this. You've got the Zodiac writing you, telling you have it all wrong. How can you honestly sit here and tell America that you are an authority on anything when you don't even listen to the individual trying to give you the real story? In this letter, he states, you need my impact. Yeah, you need my impact. Knowing now as you do regards the matches of DNA and points, and he's referring to fingerprints because he sent in his fingerprints and DNA to Tom Voight, that I am the real deal. People don't say this if they sent in something that's not going to match up. I mean, literally, that would be the dumbest thing on earth if I wanted somebody to take me serious, was to send you some fingerprints and send you some DNA and tell you that now you know I am the real deal, and then try to declare at some point this wasn't a real Zodiac letter. This wasn't the real person. All right, Tom, what have you been smoking? Anyways, we do see that over here on the left-hand side in 1991 that Arthur Lee Allen had already been cleared by fingerprints and palm prints. So I do not even understand why he continued to be a suspect, other than the fact that he died, and everybody could keep blaming him. The mystery could keep going on. They could keep writing books. They could keep making movies. They can keep doing their little America's Most Wanted and their little Zodiac escapades and conferences on an annual basis, as long as nobody knows the truth. 38 latent prints in this case, plus a palm print, were actually compared to that of Arthur Lee Allen. Why is Jack's fingerprints and palm prints not been examined if they have this information? Well, we will talk about that. I do note that also in the Tim Miller letter that Jack mentions, the silent killer with his silence broken. His silence, now this letter is written in 2005. His silence was broken in 2002 and 2003 when he tried to come out and tell everybody what was going on, because he wanted the real story told. He wanted that notoriety for being the person who got his own story told. So now in 2005, he's complaining that the killer with his silence broken, but my identity is still a secret, and understanding who is at fault is key. I'm going to go right back to the self-proclaimed authority, Tom Voight. As long as he can keep this little ruse up and keep everybody believing that there is just no perfect suspect, or there is no way that this can be solved, so then why run a message board? Why keep theorizing? Who wants to spend their life sitting around going, well, maybe, well, maybe? No. Let's get down to the actual active investigation. Let's make the comparisons that need to be made, and let's get this case going. So it is media's biggest money-making industry, and the suspect who had been cleared by fingerprints in 1991, Arthur Lee Allen, DNA in 2002. I have 2000 on my scope here, but we will show you how 2002 is actually the year it was done, and his handwriting, which we will see later as well in the presentation. So why is Hollywood still trying to enforce this false notion of a suspect into 2007 with the Zodiac Killer movie that was played by Robert Downey Jr. and Jake Gyllenhaal? And why did Tom Voight continue to disseminate this information as the Zodiac expert on his website? I think everybody can actually come to their own conclusions, and I don't have to tell you why. I think that money will be lost. People will stop making money. So it's been said that Allen was a pilot and had a small plane. Jack actually mentions having done some flying lessons with a friend during this era. He also indicated that he knew Alla, after I call him Alla, A-L-A, Arthur Lee Allen. He sees Alla on the news being accused of the Zodiac crimes, and he actually mentions out loud, I know him. That nice man gave me a ride from Lake Berryessa. Now, this is something that was obviously later down the road, or years down the road, that this news report had come out, because Dennis actually recalls him saying, that nice man gave me a ride home from Lake Berryessa, which I believe there is some truth to that, but I believe that he probably knows Alla a little bit better. And Alla became that patsy, that he knew that he would become that patsy. And that's why the information was projected or portrayed that way. Now, Alla died at the age of 58 years old of a reported heart attack. Could have been the stress of this type of accusations. I did read an article in which he had stated that 20 years after they had cleared him and left him alone, they actually raided his house, took his watch, took his belongings, took all kinds of stuff. Needless to say, it resulted in nothing. Once again, they had nothing. He was never arrested. He was never indicted. This man was just harassed by society in general. Now, in 2002, there was no more excuse for that. 2000, there was no more excuse for that. When Jack was actually offered up to the FBI as a suspect, that should have been what they ran with. They should not have been continuing on the words of Tom Voigt, him being the authority, or him helping to act as a consultant on any of these things. Should never even have whispered Alan's name. And if you were such an authority, you knew these things. So that means you're purposely deceiving the public. Alla's backstory runs pretty parallel to that of John Mark Carr in the John Benet Ramsey murder. It is another patsy set up to fall for a crime they did not commit, but somehow had some connection to the circumstances outside of our peripheral. There had been discussions that possibly Alla had also flown his plane to Riverside, which I guess might have been known. This may have been how Jack got back and forth during these times. We don't know. Alla also had a Zodiac diver's watch, and as far as I can tell, it's the only circumstantial evidence aside from being a pedophile that they had that they declared made some connection. Just because he had a Zodiac diver's watch, he didn't even buy it personally. It was bought to him as a gift by his mother. So this is that particular article that I was talking about that comes in and discusses the actual DNA testing that had been done. It does appear that the DNA came off the letters, not off of the stamp. So the information we're hearing now about DNA on the outside of a stamp that had been identified as an individual who couldn't possibly have been the Zodiac Killer is not the DNA that they used to test against Arthur Lee Allen, the other 7 suspects with 20 on 20. But this article does talk about it is in conjunction with a media company, which I believe is 20 on 20. I'm not sure that they actively say that in here, but because I know what was going on at that time and I have the information and I spoke to Harry Phillips with 20 on 20, I do know that in 2002, that was what was occurring. We can see that this newspaper is dated October 15th, 2002. And then it just really kind of goes through a bit of information that was occurring at that time. It says, although they had been analyzed for handwriting and traditional fingerprints, DNA analysis was science fiction back in 1969, but an effort was made to DNA test the letters 6 years ago. And I'm going to say that was probably 1996, and probably at the bequest of, who knows, Robert Graysmith, another, authority, these individuals that have some in with law enforcement, have information that they are not even entitled to, because we'll talk about the results that I received from contacting law enforcement. So to state that you have information that makes you higher or mightier than anybody else in this particular situation, or with more knowledge, you have nothing more than a little bird that's whispering in your ear information, and then you are turning around and using it whichever way you want. You should be giving all sides of the story, not just your side, or not what you pick and choose to give. So basically, they said Holt retrieved saliva traces beneath a stamp and was able to replicate a DNA sample large enough to test. This is in 2002. The sample was compared to brain tissue recovered from the 1992 autopsy of Arthur Lee Allen, who was identified as the elusive killer in 2 books by Robert Graysmith, the most recent of which, Zodiac Unmasked, was published this year. So Robert Graysmith went on to publish a book after Arthur Lee Allen was cleared. Just mind-blowing. People will do anything to make money. So a partial DNA fingerprint, and this is Kelly Carroll, actually. So this newspaper article is quoting the very man who we're going to see some emails and some discussions between him and Dennis. We are actually going to hear some audio tapes as well. But Kelly Carroll is all wrapped up in the middle of this. He is very much aware, but not in one place in this article do they discuss the fact that SFPD is sitting on Jack's DNA. Now, of course, they botched that DNA, which is really kind of running again, parallel with the botching that they're trying to say now, that the DNA from the outside of the stamp was erroneously mixed up with other DNA, and that led them to somebody who was not the Zodiac. It almost kind of sounds reminiscent of them attempting to go back and now try to claim that this particular DNA test was not correct. So 2002 original letters still existed. So we're now at a point in time. By the time I met Dennis in 2009, I was told that these letters, the original letters, were non-existent, that they went missing in 2005. Now, what we do and can track up to that point, that in 2002, they were available for testing. By 2005, they were no longer available, but Tom Voigt was able to show high-resolution color scans of these. He should never even had his hands on them. He should have never had access to them. They should never have been funneled to him. They should that completely negates the entire chain of custody to hand them to an outside party who is not law enforcement. And after 2005, they come up completely missing. So we have One Last America's Most Wanted that's done where we can see them in color. We have Tom Voigt portraying them in color. And now all of a sudden they're gone. My belief is they needed to be gone because everything that I'm reading, they're trying to state that without the originals, you could not convict somebody, which I think is complete and pure BS. I know that there are plenty of documents where the original was not available, that people have been held responsible for that handwriting based on an identification from a document examiner. So the fact that these letters became completely missing is in fact because Dennis Kaufman had come out with the true suspect, Jack Terrence, and they needed these letters to go away because it could be proved if they were still around as evidence. Just not a coincidence that they went missing at the same time Jack has now been identified as the leading suspect in this case. So partial DNA fingerprint is developed, as I said. I made my first contact with several agencies yesterday from Dennis's notes. I received actually a call back from a Detective Stafford from the Napa Sheriff's Department. A little disappointed by his reaction. I told him that we had evidence I was trying to bring together to see if we could get some examinations done. He had indicated that I needed to reach out to Department of Justice or to the FBI. Now, I will make my rounds back to the FBI, but of course I need to make a new connection there because our agent has retired and I'm not sure the state of the case and who's handling it at this point. But I had indicated to this detective that I have contacted the DOJ, and the DOJ tells me to contact a local law enforcement agency. And of course, I had to hold my tongue, though I did say I felt like I was running in a circle. I really wanted to call it a circle jerk because that's literally what's happening in these cases. If the DOJ is referring me back to the local law enforcement agencies, but the local law enforcement agency thinks it's okay to tell me as a member of the public that I need to contact the DOJ, and I tell them my response from the DOJ, and they continue to tell me that I need to refer back to the DOJ or to the FBI, then they do not want to work on this case. And that's absolutely ridiculous. America is owed some answer for the amount of money Hollywood has made off of this mystery while the victims' family members suffer. So after being told that, I asked if there was any evidence available, because of course I know there's fingerprints. That's not going to erode. That's not going to go away. I'm sure it's sitting in a database somewhere. In fact, I have an acquaintance at the Napa Sheriff's Department who actually told me that I needed to make a FOIA request, which I am actively doing at this point. So, for him to tell me that I needed to keep referring back to DOJ and to the FBI just tells me he didn't even want to deal with it, even though he was faced. I can give you the fingerprint. All you have to do is put it in there and do a comparison. It's either a yes or a no. You're going to come up with an answer. And what would have literally taken, I actually completed a fingerprint examination in a case that I had done not too long ago. And that fingerprint probably took me all of a couple hours. The resources were not terribly wasted. Wouldn't have taken a long time either way. And by the way, you guys, let me go back here real quick. Arthur Lee Allen is nothing like the actual composite that is seen. So, of course, even Tom Voigt wants to downplay that composite could look like anybody. I've seen some of the emails between him and Dennis, but it could look like anybody. Well, you know what? That is a pretty darn good specific composite in comparison to many that I've seen in these cases. And that's likely because the composite drawing was actually done by a police officer who spoke to Jack. He actually spoke to the Zodiac, and the Zodiac makes a comment that or they asked him if he saw anything strange. The Zodiac responds, "I saw a black man running, waving a gun around the corner." That brings me back to, how did the Zodiac know that they were looking for a black man? Sounds to me like there's a little bit of inside information here, or that call into the police department to report the actual murder of Paul Stein may have been premeditated to some degree, since the Zodiac knew to say that a black man was wielding a gun running around the corner when they were erroneously told that a black man was the one that killed Paul Stein. So we're starting to see a connection there with some premeditation and some inclusion. I mean, it only becomes a conspiracy when more than one person is a part of it. And it's not a theory on my part, because I'm only repeating what the news reports actually said. So the next suspect, Earl Van Best Jr., was another one that came up in the last couple of years. Oh, you guys. All right. So we're going to make it back to these false suspects next week. I got through as much as I could today, but we'll be climbing into the Zodiac and Jack's comparatives at that time. Everybody have a great weekend, and we'll see you next Friday. Bye.